Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with IIST and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, What Projects Teams Need to Know About Test Automation by Jim Trentadue. We're excited you're able to join us today and set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars to introduce the topics as well as the presenters of the upcoming PSQT conference in San Diego, California, August 14th through the 19th at the Sheraton San Diego Hotel and Marina. PSQT is the only conference that focuses on practical best practices in every aspect of software quality assurance and testing. The ongoing theme of the conference, Practical, Proven, Feasible, keeps a focus on what works. To learn more about this exciting conference, visit psqtconference.com. You may submit your questions at any time by using your question box in your GoToWebinar window. Today's presenter will answer as many questions within the time allowed at the end of today's session. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing within 48 hours at psqtconference.com. At the end of today's webinar, you will be asked to complete a short survey. At IIST, we strive to provide the highest quality educational resources for the public and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete this short survey. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Jim Trentadue. Jim?
Thank you, Eric. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Trentadue, and I am going to present today on what project teams need to know about successful automation. First, I definitely would like to thank Eric and the folks over at IIST, and definitely looking forward to the PSQT conference. As a previous attendee and speaker, I can certainly say it's well worth a very worthwhile conference to attend. So, with that and the webinar series, I love what they are doing with this. So please keep up to date and look to see what webinars are available through them. All right, so we're going to jump in here, talk a little bit more about what project teams need to know about successful test automation. So the first thing we're going to do, we'll walk through the agenda now, key points to know about test automation, how each project team function can contribute to automation, and then contribution impact by testing phase, then finally a presentation recap. So let's jump into it. The automation antidote. I put this whole wheel up here to start because I wanted to show you what it looks like. Automation, it can fix the bottleneck, we know that, or it can be the bottleneck. So let's look at what happens here. We know that it starts with manual testing. So at some point with manual testing, we know that we need to get to a point where we want to automate. The time is too long. We hear from our project managers, it's taken too long. We have overruns, delays in our schedule, and lo and behold, it's the testers working the weekends. So it's the initial focus, it's focusing on stable applications. But what we find is that it's requiring specialist tech skills, maybe that it's unable to survive application changes. Now the automation that you produced becomes that roadblock to testing, because that's the only way you're testing it now. Finally, there's a return to manual testing. Then once again, it's this vicious cycle. So it gets back to manual testing that we can't do that. We don't want to return to manual testing, but when we're pushed into it, we have to get back to that point. So how do we get to that point where we don't have automation be the bottleneck anymore? And I'm sure there's many people out there, myself included, have enough shelfware of my automation solutions, and we know that there's freeware out there, and certainly if you don't have the skill set to bring in the freeware, then it's going to be even more difficult. So there is a lot of years of expensive shelfware and the freeware that has gone underutilized, we'll just say. So what are some key points we need to know about automation? Differentiation from manual testing. Again, this is more from a perspective of your project teams. We're not even going to talk about the benefits. We're going to talk about some of the key differences. Application interaction. Keyword here to know, accessibility. So what does that mean? If I have an application that has a login ID and password, as a manual tester, I'm just typing in, I know I go into that login field, and the password field and type in a password. But what automation do, and this is just general from tools perspective, it's digging into what's called the accessibility layer. So if that's new term to some people, this is something to know. Whereas this login ID field, it has an object name. Maybe it's text box 1. It has an object ID. Maybe it could be 25. Inner text, login ID. This is by and large how the majority of automation solutions are going in and recognizing what the element is. So it's really, from a perspective of automation, it's about object recognition. It's really, that is one of the key points throughout this whole thing, is that it is different. So this object name, object ID, inner text, that's maintained by your development team. But it's not impactful unless you're doing automation. So it could be just generic, that a developer could have that, or they could have some good naming standards. Regardless, it's not, if they don't have good naming standards, it's not necessarily their fault, because it's nothing that anyone has ever asked of them that they needed before. So keyword, interacting with the application, think of a word accessibility to those elements and objects. Test case development, think modularity. So what does modularity mean here? A traditional manual test case, let's take a look at this. I may have 3 test cases that I have: create a work order, update a work order, delete a work order. And within that work order, I have the steps where I log in, I go through my administration screen, I add some items, I go to my work order, and I hit submit, and I purchase something. Or I put in a work order, a work request to do something. And it's typically what I'd have in my manual test case is a flow through that. Whereas an automation method, you're taking a look at, you start with that test case 1, just create a work order. But here you have a separate automation test case just for logging in. So potentially that could be reused for other test cases. You have maybe a test case for work order data entry. You have one for your confirmation screen. And finally, maybe a logout. So now I have 4 test cases that are separate from an automation perspective that built up one from an and I've grouped these: login, work order, data entry, confirmation screen, logout, to build my create work order, as opposed to just going with the flow within my manual method. So think modularity at that point, because now with my login ID, my login script, I can take that and I can share that. I can use test case 1.1 in test case 2 up above. I can use test case 1.2 in test case 2 as well, test case 1.4 and test case 3. So you get the gist of the modularity. All right, so execution, reliability. I think the key word at that point. There is one key thing here to know with your automation compared to, I mean, this is true to a point for manual test cases, but much more so for automation. Where is the issue? Is the issue with my application under test? So if I found a bug with my automation, is that actually an error with my application, or is it an error with my automated test cases? And honestly, it could be 50-50 here. So it's first to rule out that it's not a problem with your automated test cases. And if it is, then those scripts are maybe not as reliable as you think they are. All right, so let's take a look at this. Highlighted some contributions here. I want to talk about some key themes for each functional area, and we're going to go into these much more in depth. How can these roles, test automation has been largely viewed as this is a QA initiative. This is something the QA teams can do. So, but it's certainly benefiting the entire project team, whether that's your project managers, your BAs, it could benefit everybody. The quality does, and it helps the testing timelines. So why does the burden of what the automation needs to do fall solely on the QA teams? This is what really needs to change. So what can a project manager do? How about manage this as an IT initiative? We understand that project managers are managing the business initiatives, but they also manage IT initiatives, and this is one of them. So the scope, time, cost of what's been allocated for a separate initiative for automation. The business analysts, they can help with the technical requirements for the applications under test. I'm going to use that AUT and SUT for application under test and system under test. The developers are key in this, key to help with the application standardization. Back to what I was talking about, those object names and object indexes, that's something that they can certainly help for object recognition and accessibility, making sure that the object is accessible and that it's accessible by a standard name. If there's nothing else that is of the utmost importance, it would be that one. Everything else is very important as well, but that is, I would put that as my number one. DBAs, the data and the database integrity. So we know that we want to have static conditions, but with dynamic data. That's a key benefit of automation. But how do we do that? How do we make sure that the database is intact, and how do we make sure that we have the right data flowing into our tests? Our system testers definitely want to set the testing direction. How do we navigate between what is better to do from a manual testing perspective versus a test automation perspective, and the differences between the two? There's certainly going to be benefits to still doing manual testing within this realm, but hopefully it's limited, and it's not the repeatable test that we have to do, testing across each browser for every build that we have. Then finally is your IT management. We need to have them as our champion here. We need to have them to say, yes, we see the benefits of what can be gained with test automation, and we want to continue to move forward. All right, let's jump in a little bit more to each one of these areas. Let's take a look at the project managers. So we talked about scope, time, cost. Nothing more than just a little Gantt chart, what they have to do from a test perspective. They're going to allocate the resources accordingly. But it's up to us. We are going to be a key customer for the project manager and what we need for automation. So we're going to play a little different role. We're going to be the customer, but we're also going to be maybe contributing. We need them to allocate the resources accordingly. And by that, I mean I need a BA to help me talk about all of my business conditions that I have in my applications under test, and what helped me scope out what we're looking at this. I got these desktop applications, I got these web applications on Automate, so it's a whole list of everything. They manage the schedules for this. Nothing more. It can't, I've worked, and I'm sure there's going to be people who have in this regard. I've worked in situations where I was responsible for 2 weeks in between schedules where I've had to go ahead and try and get automation in, or we have a 2-month gap, try to get this in, instead of building this as an initiative. So it was always trying to scramble into this as much as possible. They maintain the project budget. This is absolutely essential. What this means here is that if there's concerns, if you're using a commercial tool, then you got to be cognizant, and if you're leasing it or if you own it, you have to be aware of the licensing models and if it expires or not. So especially if you're using a leased model, yeah, you want to know that it's not going to expire right in the middle of your initiative. If you're using a freeware tool, as an example, you're probably going to have some contractors working on this solution, making sure that they're not rolling off the project anytime soon. And finally, they're collaborating with the test manager and test lead. And I wouldn't necessarily say the test manager would be the key customer in this. I would really put this as maybe a test lead or the senior test analyst who's going to be the consumer of it. So they are the customer in this regard, and the test manager is helping to be one of the sponsors for that. So it's really managing this as a perspective of how can the project manager help get the necessary resources from the BAs, the developers, dedicated for even a period of time onto this initiative. Our business analysts. So again, they're maintaining the requirements, nothing more than a view here, just look at requirements, linking them to your test cases just to make sure we have proper coverage. The technical requirements for the applications under test. They're going to lead the requirements gathering session. We know that. This is part of their job. So even what you see from the PMs and the BAs, and in some of these other regards, it's nothing shocking. You know, but it's what they do on their regular basis as their job now. But why can't they do this for our automation initiative? So we want to know, yes, we want to know, we want the BA to lead some JAD sessions or some, you know, requirements gathering sessions to say, all right, what do we need from this test automation tool? We need it to be user-friendly. We need it to work with, you know, some manual testers. We need this to happen. So we give it the requirements, and now we try to find the solution that best fits that. Again, whether that's commercial, open source, but you find the right solution that fits your need. They're going to document the business rules to be, so us as testers, we're aware of these when considering for automation. They're going to serve as that conduit to UAT to really help say, let's look at your business scenarios. What about those getting those into automation as well? And are we missing anything? Because typically when we're going to be buying an automation tool, we're going to be buying it for all testing efforts, right? It's going to be, this really should be applicable for anything, whether it's unit testing, system testing, integration testing. I'm sure upper management is not going to buy in to say, we're going to buy you a solution just for system testing. They want to see how does it help testing overall. And finally, knowledge of integrated systems and data. So if there is data or if there's systems I need to run my test successfully, I would need my business analyst to know those. All right, on to our developers. Application standardization. You can take a look at just a screen here. You see we got some more standard names, and again, you probably have used that as well throughout any of the automation solutions you're using, but give it something more of a logical name as opposed to, see if you could see here, you got username, and I'm sure maybe some of the automation professionals have this. Instead of using list item 1 here, click on list item 1. Well, that doesn't really help me. What is that? Oh, that's username, that's password. So the developers can certainly help out in this regard. They're keeping the object naming conventions. They're maintaining that these objects can be accessible. So it's very possible, depending if you might be using some older Windows applications, whereas clicking on a field in automation, if accessibility is not turned on from a development perspective, majority of test automation tools cannot see it then. They can't interact with that. By and large, most tools probably cannot. They debug test cases because depending, again, looking at the solutions you may have, there may be a lot of code that is generated in the background. So if there is a lot of code and now you need to figure out what's wrong with this test case, you may need to lean on a developer to help, or someone with a development skill set to help you debug this test case to get it running properly. So it's something just to consider as well. They divert to write code libraries. So there might be a code library to help you run this test successfully, whether you're using, again, open source, commercial. If there's code required in the background, you may need to lean on developers' time to get you up and running. And that's where it goes back to that project manager. Even for current initiatives, you have to go back to that project manager to say, I understand developer A is working on this business initiative, but I need them to stop and help me write this code library so I can get my automation. It's just a matter of prioritization and getting that into the mix. What can our DBAs do for us? They can look at basically how our automation is working. Total transactions, commits, everything that our automation is doing and how it's affecting the database and helping with our data. So they map the database effects from the tests. So what I mean by that is that let's take a look at what that is from my automation test. What kind of impact did that have to my database? How many tables did I update? How many fields did I update? And what were my data points that were updated? It was 300, data points that were committed, it updated 2 rows, what have you. So I definitely like to know the impact that my automation is having on my database. So what would be nice is that if I had that automatic, I don't have to go write it as soon as I'm done with my test, maybe go check my back end just to make sure that the database updated. I'm sure many QA folks do that on a regular basis, and that's just I did, and I had my teams do that as well. That was just that extra security level, just to say, all right, we want to make sure that the data ended up in its final resting spot in the database or in a particular mainframe, what have you. They're maintaining the test environments. So there's a kind of consideration here. Do you want to have a test environment that's static for automation? If so, we definitely need the DBA to help us with that, to make sure that's clean. Or do we want to have a test environment that's we can roll back to and go to a certain point of time and constantly have dynamic data, so, and have a baseline of the data that we needed. Certainly a consideration. I mean, to do these tasks, it requires a DBA's time. So it'd be awesome if we had the ability to kind of maintain some of that ourselves through automation, with the DBA's help and blessing to make sure, not to overtake any DBA job, but if we had some kind of process that could do that, that would be wonderful. That way the DBA can concentrate on the production database and the production data set, where that's where our money is coming in. Enables data privacy. I'm sure there's many people out there that have compliance issues with HIPAA or any kind of SOX compliance for data privacy, whether it's credit card numbers, addresses, social security numbers. But yet we don't want to know that number per se in a test environment, but we need that profile. We need John Smith, and who's of this age, and we don't need to know his social security number, but we need his demographics or his profile to help fill in for the rest of our test. Scramble that number, that's truncate it, whatever we need to. We don't need to know the number, but we need our DBA to help us with the data privacy in this regard. Finally, they're going to compare the tables and the data across the databases. So if we are running automation across several environments, we want to know, going back to that test execution where the keyword was reliability, we want to make sure that it is reliable across the environments that we're working on. Our system testers, what can they do for us? How about some test steps? How about some steps to say exactly what they're trying to do that is automation ready? So we want to make sure that they've written these test cases to a perspective that they are automation ready. I'm sure there are many people in automation right now, and again, I've managed these folks as well. I've managed where I've had manual testers and automation testers, and my automation team said, Jim, I know that the manual tester said they wanted these test cases to be automated, but they are not in a state to be ready for automation. And when writing this test case, just like the developers, we're talking about accessibility and object naming standards, we didn't expect at all to be writing these test cases to be automation ready and to be modular. I mean, we wrote it to a point where it can be easy to navigate through, but that's it. So we provide manual test cases to automate. So we are going to have the test cases that are automation ready, and we need them to make sure that they have the appropriate candidates for automation. They identify validation points in my application under test. So not every step is a validation point. So there's going to be some steps that are navigation that we go through, but finally, what are we actually testing? It's to understand that. Validation points, that's a key thing in test automation. So that you have your steps, but then test automation tools have you identify what your validation point is. It's going to capture the step-by-step details of what your automation test is. Then finally, they're going to document the end-to-end test scenarios that are there. So if there is something that we want to automate more breadth versus depth, we need them to help identify what the end-to-end scenario is. Finally, our IT management. What do? They promote initiative through IT organization. They secure capital funding. That's kind of an important thing, whether it's for resources or a tool perspective. They understand the related ROIs and KPIs for this. So I brought this test in here. I brought this test in here to, or this graph to take a look at. We know how expensive it is, the defects introduced in this phase, defects found in this phase, and how much it costs. So we can say how much automation can certainly help in this area. Finally, with our help, we're going to let them know how we want to move forward with automation. But it's not going to be automation, it's going to be a journey. This is not to say we want to put automation in place and have it done in year one. You may automate your initial scope of applications in year one. However, you're going to look at what it takes to maintain it and what's the full operation of how do you extend that further. Improving testing by phase. So the better testing eliminates the testing chaos. Let's take a look at this, the automation adoption here. We have two different scales, and this is, again, with any solution. To the left, you have more technical and more specialists, more automation specialists that you have. These are typically some of your tools that require a little bit more programming in them. And then you have one that's required, no coding skills required. So it's whatever tool is best in your environment. There's certainly pros and cons of both. But regardless, the more technical, no matter how far left we are here from more technical and more specialists, the specialists and their technical automation folks are always trying to engage the folks who don't have the programming skills. So even though this is where the automation may occur, there's a constant movement. We've heard of the notion of shift left in the industry, and shift left for better quality is a great slogan. But it's shift left for better quality, shift right though for better testing. That doesn't necessarily say we're doing testing right. So how do we, even if we do select a solution that has no coding skills required, or we have solutions that are already implemented, more technical and more specialists, how is that framework written to engage the folks who don't have the coding skills? That's certainly a challenge, but it's a lofty goal, and it's one that we should always be trying to strive to get to. What's the team goal here? Do testing better. So it's not to say shift left is a very viable industry standard right now to get shift left for better quality, but shift right for better testing. Because it's still, even though we have the quality implemented here, it's not saying we're doing the testing right, and that's a focus too that we want to make sure we get to. What are some pros and cons of having the more technical and more specialists? It is cheaper or free software. They're by and large better known in the marketplace. So when you say I need to, I'll use Selenium as an example, I need to find a Selenium programmer or a Selenium automation developer. Typically you can find folks with that skill set, and it's easy to look out there to get that. But it is a significant investment to implement. There's no doubt that it's, for those who have implemented that, it's some months to get up and running. Once it's running, then you're in good shape. But that is something to consider. That's more from a resource perspective to get that going. And it's better known in the marketplace, but it does require specialized resources. Again, I'm not saying anything revolutionary here. This is what's well known. I'm just putting this pen to paper. Here you're going to find more your developers, DBAs potentially, or QA specialists that are going to fill in this more technical and more specialist role where they contribute to the overall effort. What are some pros and cons of the no coding skills? It's an increased utilization of automation by its better adoption for the entire team. Automation done earlier by everyone. Cons, there probably is a higher entry point cost to buy or build this, and it's potentially a little longer to implement. So, again, you have to look at what's there in your environment. If you have majority of manual testers who want to do automation but don't have the programming skills, then you're probably going to look at solutions that don't require coding skills. If you have more, if you have a team of automation specialists who have technical skill set, then maybe you look at the Seleniums, depending on what you have. So it all depends on what's in your environment. Something to consider. So here, where do you have in this adoption? Typically more your BAs and your functional QAs are going to fall in this realm. Again, you know, there's nothing to say that, so I have developers in this role over here. I mean, that's up to the project manager to make sure it's scheduled out. I have BAs. Again, this is an IT initiative, so how do we make sure this is on the docket as an IT initiative? Favorable impressions. Let's take a look at what we can gain with management here. So whether you're doing waterfall, agile, or agile-ish, I like to call it, system testing or component testing, what are we going to gain? Notice how, I'm sorry, in this previous one, I don't have the project managers here, because the project managers are the one who are responsible for delivering the total project to the stakeholder, right, with all the contributions as a team. But at the end, they're going to ask the project manager, where did this start to go off if something does go wrong? And maybe your IT directors, and there's going to be people that have to answer to this. So if we do have automation, system testing or component testing, it's more predictable. What do we leave the impression with them? That our testing is more predictable and it's dependable. It's running each and every time. What are we leaving them with our integration or story testing? Is that we're thorough with our integration testing, and this is done on a regularity, where we're running these tests regularly. How did that full run of the automation go? Oh, great, found a defect. How did it go? Oh, it went fine last night. So it gives them that regularity that they know it's going to be running, as opposed to saying, well, if a project manager has to come to a test lead or test manager and say, we have to retest these battery of tests. Wouldn't that be nice to say, no problem, we can just, I'll run that overnight, we'll know in the morning, as opposed to saying, that's another 3 days of effort, that's another 2 days. We can try to do risk-based testing to eliminate down. Instead, we can just run our battery of tests. What about acceptance testing or release testing? The accountability and the confidence that is gained from that is immense. I'm sure there's folks, I've been in mixed bags, and I am sure there are folks out on this call that have worked with UAT who said, yeah, I've tested. Well, what did you test? And did you get any documentation from them? No. But you're not pushing on them so hard to say, did you test this? And they said, yeah, it looks good. I checked this out for this kind of ID and this, and I played around a little bit. Yeah, everything looks good. As a tester, that never gave me the confidence, and I'm like, how do I get that? So is there anything from a UAT perspective that's automating your business flow that we help them get an automation perspective down, that they can run the test or they can just hit play? It might be us that's maintaining it, but we're helping get that regard. So it would be a wonderful thing to do. All right, so a recap perspective. Let's talk about what we have in here. If I'm going to leave 3 points to take away, and then I'll certainly have enough time for questions, and then let you get going to lunch if you're on the Central Time. Test automation, it can clear the source of the problem, or it can be the source. So I'm sure there's people out here who do have shelfware for scripts and saying, no one's touched these scripts for months, and now it's a bear to try to maintain. That's a key, that's a thing of automation. So if it's not constantly maintained, yeah, it could be the source of the problem. It definitely demands a wide buy-in to ensure success. So that's why what I'm saying here is that if we need developers to help go in and take a look at that automation, if you don't have the specialists, maybe it is the automation folks that are the automation folks that have left the organization. Now you need developers to get in there and help just get it up and running. This is something, if there's going to be nothing now, let everyone know, let your project managers, let your IT management team know where you're at with automation, to say, yep, we have one person that's maintaining it, so What's our backup plan for the entire project team to help us with this? If developers are contributing to this, if BAs, if everyone's contributing little bits of time, it's easier, it's definitely more palatable to maintain. The effort invested, it can be distributed. It's going to save time and money at the end, especially if it's distributed, as opposed to the QA teams maintaining this themselves from the test manager and just kind of knocking on someone's door, can you help me with this? If they're allocated and expected to, you know, you're going to get a wider buy-in. If there's any questions, certainly I'd love to take some now.
While we're waiting for some questions to come through, Jim, can you possibly just give us some typical questions that you usually get when giving this presentation?
Yeah. So some things I've gotten asked about before is this: to say, what kind of time frame do I have to show automation is going to be successful? To my project managers, to all my stakeholders. And again, I'd consider stakeholders to be, by and large, your project teams, your development managers. There's a number of things. What kind of timeline can I expect for that? And one of the things that one of the answers I typically give is, it seems for me as well, when I've implemented automation, I get checkpoints in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, but that 1 year mark is really the key one. So it's going to be up to you to provide those checkpoints to your upper management, to say, here's where we're at in 3 months, we're automating this. But at the end of a year, they're going to say, I bought you this tool 12 months ago. Where you're at with automation? If you don't provide those checkpoints, even if you have a tool right now that's implemented, you want to leverage more. Certainly, that's something to consider. So I'm going to take a look at what my do we have any questions on here?
We do have a few questions.
Okay. I'm more than happy to.
Can you view the questions, Jim?
Yeah, I can certainly go through.
Perfect.
All right, so let me take a look at some of these. All right. Can everyone still see my screen okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let me... How do we calculate the return on investment for the automation we are doing at the beginning of the project instead of starting once the application is stable? That's an awesome question. I'd like to see, you know, I guess I would like to write out I'd like to write out a test strategy to say, here's how much automation we planned on this, and here's the amount of people that we were planning on having on this. So for us to maintain this project, it's going to take 5 resources at this level. However, if we automate, we might be able to do this with 2 resources to let those other 3 go on to additional things. So and maybe 1 resource for manual testing, for maybe a little bit more exploratory testing, or working with the users. So automation, to add to that, automation certainly, by no means am I ever advocating, because I'm a QA guy by heart, and manual testing is so important. By no means am I ever advocating that it's going to replace people, but it certainly repurposes them. So from a return on my investment, I certainly take a look at I certainly want to take a look at how many people it would take to maintain this for a period of time. That would be one of my key things to certainly take a look at. Let me see, other questions. Will these slides be available, and will this be a recorded webinar? That's certainly Eric can talk about that in a second. Let me go through. if you haven't started any automation testing and you do outsource testing, do you recommend looking for more of the Selenium angle? Good question. It could very well be that you look at Selenium. I guess it would, there's pros and cons. I mean, if you're working with an offshore team who has a solid foundation, and you have the number of resources, all the number of resources available with Selenium, then yeah, that could be a key thing. That could be a key attribute for you. There's just a difference between open source tools, and not just Selenium, open source tools versus commercial tools in general, is that with open source tools, your support is through a forum. Commercial tools, you're paying for it, but you're getting support. So it all depends on where you're kind of at from a budget perspective. If you don't have budget for tools, but you have budget for resources, then that might be the better way for you to go. But that's what I would consider taking a look at that. How should we make our management buy in the point of investing in more test automation? That's easy. I think that's going to be. I think that'll be showing where you can talk about some of these repeatable tests to say how long it's taking you on each one of these tests. You've got to pick some candidates, though. I'm not just going to say, here's all this. Pick some good tests that you know are killers, that are just going to take that every time you have to test this one across IE 8, 9, 10, 11, IE 27, Chrome, Firefox, and you have to test all of these all the time, and it's repeatable in some of the things that you're finding. I would really, that's the question is, to Pavan, I hate to say it, that automation initiatives usually no one starts it off by saying, yeah, you know what, let's do automation. They're doing it because they feel some pain. And there's pain attributed and involved in saying, you know what, we need to get these tests automated. It's typically moving in that regard. So not that you want to highlight it during a painful point in a stressful period, but to mention as soon as a test gets done and you've got done working 3 weekends in a row, the testers have, because the project slipped throughout, that's certainly something you can address. All right, so let me go through more questions. What tools do you see fitting the end of the spectrum that has no coding required? This is the only thing I'm going to talk about. I certainly invite anyone, but I do believe we have a solution in that regard at Original Software with Test Drive, but it's, again, that's one of a couple solutions out there. I certainly invite you to take a look at that. Again, with this, that's all I'm going to say to that. I don't want to use this at any means to talk about solutions. This is making test initiative as a kind of audit requirement. Yeah. But think about the audit documentation that you have. You have test results that are produced automatically. You have your test steps that are produced automatically, and you have the logs of this. You have your audit requirements done. I mean, so with any test automation solution. The challenge here is that each module track will have, say, manual testing. We cannot pitch in and more and bypass this. No, certainly. This is contributing. It's how the other project team members can contribute to this. So maybe it's the manual testers to say, automation testers, you do these tests now. I'll focus on this. Instead of a manual tester having these 50 tests to run, which 30 of which can be automated, they're concentrating on making those 20 better. And they're, again, I hate to say it, that shift right kind of mentality, that they're doing better testing for the 20 because they don't have to concentrate on doing it all. They're, instead of pure coverage to making sure they got their tests done, they're getting each test done better. I'm sorry. Some of our IT staff is interested in continuous integration. Automation with continuous integration is awesome. If you can get that working, and a lot of solutions work with that. So it's a lot of time, the automation solution is usually tied into whether it's Bamboo, Jenkins, even Jira or TFS, that it's linked in, and as the build gets done, it's usually it can fire off a batch script or some kind of integration into your solution. Take a look at solutions you got. I think a lot of solutions have that, and a lot of solutions have that ability to configure. So we have another one. My quality engineer writes Selenium tests, and I don't know their tests. Selenium is code. I mean, it's certainly, again, it certainly serves a purpose in a lot of organizations. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but Selenium is code. So if you're not working with it, it's once you start to get into the code a little bit better, then you might be able to pick up more. That's where you might, again, if you don't know those tests, that's where you might need to go to a developer and ask your project manager how you can get a developer, because that's, if you don't, it's not going to be, if you don't know coding now, then go take a class and you're going to have to learn programming. And that's, by and large, for our manual testing community, we're not programmers. Doesn't mean there's some people that don't have development skill sets, but by and large, as an industry, we're not programmers, and we don't want to be. If you haven't started in automation yet, we talked about that. I'm a QA and writing test cases for manual testing. For automation, can the same test cases be reused? Yes, I would take a look at that. Certainly do an audit to say, I would hope that it would be. I would say yes, you should start with that, but think of every click, think of every business rule that you're trying to initiate, and if that it doesn't require domain knowledge. How to assess a team's readiness to implement automation? Oh, that's a great question, and that's there's a lot of things I would take a look at that. From a project team perspective, I would see that there's time to automate. The artifacts are ready for automation, and you have a support team ready to have that. So not only get it off the ground, once it's off the ground, do I have the artifacts ready that can be automated? And then secondly, and just as important, what is my support level to do this? And if I'm using a more technical solution, yes, then I definitely need to have folks that know the code for anything that comes along the lines. Whether you're doing descriptive programming in QTP UFT, which is still programming, whether you're using Selenium, it's going to be folks who need to maintain this once it's live. So hopefully that's not a large number of folks, but you know, it depends. This is coding, so it depends on how good the coding is. How should we make our management buy into the point of more test automation? Again, I think I was talking about that earlier, Paman. We talked about how can we show how long it's taking each test to run and how long it's taking each initiative. But I would also show pain, say, look at our last 3 releases, that we've had delays in our builds. We've had delays from the BAs or scheduling or anything, our developers. We've had some defects, and we've overrun our project. I think if you can use an example of an project that was delayed or overrun to production, man, that's going to be a beautiful one to certainly highlight, to say we plan to have this done by end of February. It's now March 11th, and we are still 3 weeks away from getting this done. That will, again, I hate to say that, make them feel, highlight some of the pain of any kind of recent examples, and I think that will be a great one to show. How does a manual tester determine what should be automated, and how do they write a test ready to be automated? Each field, so Paul, what I would do is each field to be considered. I would love it if it's, think about it from a shared perspective where I'm logging into a field, explicitly state the data that's going to be used. I'd love so I can be ready. If I'm your automation guy, I would love to know that I have the data source ready, like where you put this login ID, but where can I find the table of login IDs and values? But each field to be clearly documented and highlighted. How do we calculate the return on investment? So we talked about that a little bit more. Do you know a test automation tool that can work for legacy systems? COBOL, RPG. Yeah, Miguel, I feel for you. We could certainly, I'll share my information. We can certainly talk offline because that's going to be a little bit more of a challenge. I'd have more questions in that regard. You know, what kind of mainframe kind of you're looking at. RPG is certainly an interesting one, but by and large, it's going to be a challenge. But it depends on what you want to do. I mean, if you're doing interactions with some of these systems and you're navigating through, or is that a data resting spot? Certainly, there's things to consider. Maybe there's some things that I've done in the past is query back-end database without going into the COBOL screen if it resides in a relational database somewhere. So there's things to consider. But yeah, that certainly is a challenge. Comment to an earlier question, one general answer to the ROI question. The PM academia perspective is that quality is always self-funding. It could be. It's certainly one to consider that it's self-funding, but it's self-funding from the entire project team. So again, from that, I do believe in the shift left mentality for better quality, and that's shifting it into the earlier stages of the development life cycle, agile, what have you, waterfall. But it's one that it's going to be required. You know, when you think of the PM scope, time, cost, the triangle, where does quality fit into that? You know, it's quality at every turn. So how do we get quality scope? How do we get quality timelines? And how do we get quality costings? So it's certainly one to consider. Okay, so I think, let me see if there's any other questions. I think that's all the questions. If there's, oh, I'm sorry, there is one I missed. What do you recommend with respect to integrating data into automation scripts? That is one of the key points. I mean, Peter, great question, but that is doing data-driven testing within automation. Then you are going to, a lot of solutions do that, and you're going to love, depending on your solution, again, it could require some coding to do, but once you can start to feed that in, boundary tests, equivalent class testing, negative tests, you don't have to do just like a one little sample. You can do a whole battery of tests in this regard, and that's fun. I can tell you, once you loop in the data on what you want to do, that's a fun thing to do. So you mentioned shift right and involving the business. What tools do you believe would help in this approach? I certainly, like I said, I invite you to take a look at what we have. Please contact, I can certainly answer that a little bit more off topic. But my contact information is there. It's jtrentadue, JTRENTADUE at ORIGSOFT, orgsoft.com. I can certainly talk more to that. Again, we won't use that time, but I certainly can make those recommendations for solutions out there. I think that's all the questions I have. So Eric, I want to turn that, you want to talk about?
Yes, I don't see it. I think you got all the questions, so I appreciate it. That's a lot of good feedback, a lot of good questions. It's a great topic, and it's obvious by how many questions we had today. So I want to thank you, Jim, for your time today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's free webinar sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit www.iist.org. You can follow IIST on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about IIST news, events, and promotions. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great day.